La remarquable carrière de Deb en tant qu'enseignante de français langue seconde s'est étendue sur 30 ans et ses contributions vont bien au-delà de la salle de classe. Elle occupe le rôle estimé d'aînée en résidence à la faculté d'éducation à l'Université Queen's à Kingston. Parlant couramment le français, l'anglais, le michif ontarien et depuis 215 apprenant activement l'Anishinaabe-Moin et le Kanyenkera, le réparatoire linguistique de Deb reflète son engagement à embrasser de diverses traditions. Today, Deb will be leading us in exploring the profound impact of supporting Indigenous students on the entire educational community. Her keynote, entitled A Rising Tide Lifts All Boats, How Supporting Indigenous Students Benefits Everyone, will uncover how initiatives aimed at fostering Indigenous student success empower learners and enhance the quality of education for all.
Beijing wabshke mangin gwita gabo Indigenous cause, meanwhile Debsana Mandago, Makwa and Dorum, Penetangwashin, meanwhile Henry First Nation and Dunjaba, Trenton and Dow, Anishinaabe Kwe Ode. So I put up on the screen my introduction in Anishinaabe Moin, and as an Indigenous person, I said my spirit name, Beijing Wabshke Mangan Gewete Gabo. It means Beijing is one, Wabshke is white, Mangan is wolf, and Gewete Gabo means standing in all four directions. So I have not grown into my name yet because I'm not standing very long in any direction. Yesterday I was Tuesday and Wednesday I was in Toronto. Yesterday and today I'm in Ottawa. But then after I leave here, I'm going to Petroglyphs Park in Peterborough because we have some women out fasting there, and I'm staying there till Sunday. So I keep moving around. And then I said my clan is Makwa. Makwa is bear, so I'm Bear Clan. And we get our clans from our dads. So my dad was Bear Clan, my mom is Crane Clan. And then because I'm Indigenous and we are the land, I situated myself on the land. So I was born in Penetangwashin. And my dad and all my siblings were born in Penetangwashin too. On my dad's side, we were originally Drummond Islanders, and when the Americans won the war, Drummond Island became American, and the people who wanted to remain loyal to the Crown resettled. So my family resettled in the Red River area of Manitoba and in Penetangwashin. And on my mom's side, we're Ojibwe from Henvey Inlet First Nation, which is a small First Nation near Parry Sound. And I live in Trenton. And I said I have an Anishinaabe heart. So that's my formal introduction in the land. Usually we tell you like all kinds of other information about us in our traditional introductions, like we usually say who our father was and what his lineage is, and our mom and that too. But yeah, this is me. I was a French teacher for 30 years, FSL, core French for a little bit, but mostly immersion. And I used to wear this jacket out in the schoolyard, and the kids would follow me around, and they'd be braiding my tassels all of the time. They're braiding, and there'd be like an event happen, and somebody would be sore or hurt, and I'd have to go over there, and I'd have all these kids hanging on me at the back wanting to finish their braids. But I was the teacher that they would come to, even if they weren't in my class, if they were Indigenous, because for our students, by our students I mean Indigenous students, we think that the residential school era is over, but the new residential school system is the foster system, because our kids are overrepresented and have been forever in the foster care system. So the school that I taught at, almost all of the foster kids were Indigenous, and they would come, like even if they were not in my French immersion class, they would come and follow me around at recess and say, my sister said that you're the one I should come to because you understand. So I think that's important that they see role models, because we're still only 1% of the teaching population. Indigenous educators still only make up 1%. Now the Rideau Hall Foundation just hired a friend of mine to, her job is to increase the number of Indigenous educators across Canada by 10,000. So that's a lot. So for understanding Indigenous students, I think it's important to get to know your students, because when you walk in a room, you don't necessarily see people stand out as Indigenous. Some have like the dark skin and the long, straight, dark hair, but then others have blonde hair and blue eyes, and you wouldn't know. So I think it's important to talk to your students, whatever age they are, and get to know like what their heritage is, no matter what heritage it is, because you can't always tell by looking at someone. I remember doing a talking circle with I think they were a grade 11 class a few years ago. They'd gone to see Indian Horse and they wanted to have a talking circle afterwards. And they said, there's no Indigenous kids in this circle. And I said, well, there's someone in the circle that I've seen at a lot of Indigenous events, and I'm fairly certain she's Indigenous. And her teacher looked at her and said, if I had to choose anybody that was Irish in this classroom, I would have said you, because she had like the curly red hair and the green eyes. But she was Indigenous, so you can't always tell. And I think it's also important to learn about the histories of the land where you are. Like now, every school board has a land acknowledgement, and you have to kind of move beyond the land acknowledgement and learn a bit of the history of where you are to understand us better and our culture. When I do what is it called? Some kind of equity training. When I do the equity training at the Faculty of Ed, I always start with a quiz, and it's an animate, inanimate quiz, and I just show them pictures of things, and they have to tell me what's animate and inanimate. And in the dominant culture, only about 3 of the things are animate out of the 12. But in our culture, I think in my quiz there's about 9 of them that are animate, so they never do well on my quiz. And I said, well, that's because we're looking at from my worldview instead of your worldview. So now think about that in terms of when you're teaching, how are you going to reach those Indigenous kids when their worldview is so completely different from your own? Yeah, I think also knowing which students self-identify, and sometimes they won't even self-identify. I remember, like, I was teaching core French towards the end of my career because I was doing a lot of stuff with the Federation, and my principal figured that anybody could teach core French, and it would be easy to find us a apply teacher for me. And there was this one boy, like it was the end of school, and I had brought in, even though I was Indigenous, I brought in a man who was a carver, and he did carvings, and it was on Indigenous Peoples Day. It was June 21st. So the end of the school year, grade 8, I'd been his teacher for a few years of core French, and this man says, how many people here are Indigenous? And this one boy put up his hand. Like, I knew all of the others put up their hand. This one boy put up his hand. And I said, you never told me you were Indigenous. And he said, why would I tell you I'm Indigenous? I hate French. You're the French teacher. So I was like, all right then. So they won't always tell you. I think culturally responsive education is important, like to bring in elders and knowledge keepers so that we can do some Indigenous stuff in the class. This is a group that Mohini and I went to visit up in, we were in Attawapiskat, and we were learning how to make fire with using a bow drill. And it's important to do that type of thing to keep the kids in school, because if they don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum, then they don't necessarily want to stay. For me, intergenerational trauma, like I'll talk about the picture in a second. For me, when I first started teaching, the very first year I taught, I walked into school, or it was the summertime, and I was wanting to see what my schedule was. And I went to the school. It was like a really old school, one of those schools that said boys on one end and girls on the other end, like that old. And I opened the doors, and I could feel energy coming by me, and it was like super scary. And I thought, shut this door. And I shut the door, and I waited for somebody else to come. And I never once walked into the school alone because I was afraid of having that come at me. And when I thought about all of that energy, like even though the school was not a residential school, I thought like that's the intergenerational trauma, like the trauma my family has gone through, being in residential schools, coming back to like tell me that this is a scary place. So it's interesting that 41 years later, I'm still walking into schools. But I always tell the people, you know, if you're inviting an elder or an knowledge keeper to your school, you should have someone meet them at the door, because it's scary to walk into those places for some people. And some people don't even understand. When I say that in front of Indigenous people, they're there, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. I hate walking in the school. In this picture, this is a little boy in grade 6. You can see his hand. Those marks, those marks on his hand. He was in grade 6, and he had attempted suicide, but he didn't really know how to attempt suicide. So he cut himself, like where you could see the veins on his hand. And in a lot of the northern communities, you see so many children with cuts, and you see them on their wrists and where they've tried to cut themselves, and they've healed. And I stuck with that little boy when we were making the fire. And he was the only one who actually was able to build the fire, because like he stuck with it, and I was like coaching him too, because I thought this kid is a survivor and he's going to do this. And he was the only one of the kids that was actually able to make a fire himself. I think communicating with caregivers, especially if you teach young children, and not when you communicate with caregivers, I generally suggest, if it's Indigenous people, not to like make them come for parent-teacher interviews. Like meet them at the hockey rink or at the soccer field. That's what I used to do. I'd see them at Tim Hortons or in the grocery store and talk to them in those places where they feel more comfortable than coming into the school. And it's not that Indigenous parents don't want their children to succeed. They just don't want to be in that institution. So we can find other ways to communicate with them and to have those opportunities. And I usually say to, like, phone the parents at the start of the year and say something good before you have to call in and say something bad, because that gets that relationship built so that they don't think, oh no, the phone's ringing, it's going to be the school and I'm not answering. Oh, yeah, that's one of my grandsons in the picture. I was there when his mom gave birth to him, but now he's like 9 years old. And like so many of the children, especially Indigenous children, are raised by community as much as by their parents. And like I say, a lot of the Indigenous students that I taught were being raised in foster care or by their grandparents. So knowing that there's like a whole community raising these children, not just like their parents. And like I know so many kids now that are being raised by their aunts because their mom they've been taken away from their mom. So like for elementary schools, I feel sorry for the students in the class whenever the teacher says, hey, we're going to make something for Mother's Day, or we're going to make something for Father's Day. I think that's terribly cruel, because they're like the Indigenous kids quite often do not have communication with their mother or father. And I think that in this day and age, we should not be doing things like Mother's Day or Father's Day, or asking kids to write about their family tree, that type of thing, because a lot of kids don't know, and it just reinforces the hurt. So I think, and it's the same, I think, with like a lot of communities, like when immigrants come here, they don't necessarily get to come with their parents or the rest of their family. So we have to think about that too when we're teaching our students. Establishing discipline in your class is important. Like the students need to know the rules. So I used to, when I was teaching, I liked to co-create rules with the students. I would go in with the ideas that I wanted to have, but I did generally get them to co-create the ideas as well. So we would, I don't know, talk about the 7 grandfathers and how we could have like a respectful class, a loving class, a brave class, and work on our discipline that way so that everybody knew what their expectations were. I think having culturally relevant materials, I don't remember ever seeing Indigenous materials when I was going to school in the classroom. And I think that it's important to have, like, more and more schools are making the grade 11 language course Indigenous books and plays, etc. I think that's important. And places like the website goodminds.com, they have vetted all of the books that they sell. They've been read by an Indigenous scholar who says whether or not they're good books to use, and they have them also so that they are divided into categories. So if you're teaching secondary school French, you can put like secondary school French, and all of the books in French that they have will show up that way. So I think that's important too, that more and more libraries are being filled with Indigenous books, and more classrooms are having Indigenous books. But sometimes you also have to look at the books too. Like, I remember, like, when I was still teaching, the librarian had gone to a book buying thing and came back, and she had this one Indigenous book, and she was so excited about it. It was Indigenous, and it was French, and it had been written in France. And it was about the Inuit, and there they were in their villages with all these trees. And I said, well, obviously this person's never been up north to notice that we don't have trees up north. So making sure that it's like written preferably in Canada. There are so many, like since the TRC recommendations come out, there have been more and more Indigenous authors. So there are so many good authors that you can choose from now that are Canadian and know a little bit more than if it's somebody in France writing a French book about Indigenous issues. Uh-oh. I broke it. Oh, it works. Yeah, so including Indigenous perspectives. The government was, for a while, trying to do that, and then we got a new government and canceled all that. But Indigenous people are continuing to make educational materials that can be used in your classes. So maybe having some of that in the curriculum, inviting in elders and knowledge keepers. Every school board now in Ontario has to have a First Nations Métis Inuit education lead, and that person usually can hook you up with Indigenous people that will come into your classes. I don't know what the budget is for each board. I work a lot with the Limestone board, and their budget is like each school can have like 10 days, like Indigenous people can come in like 10 different times. So that's a good start. Okay, talking circles. I like to use talking circles. In a talking circle, there's also rules. So we usually start out by making rules. The main rules in a talking circle are only the person holding the talking object, whether that be a stick or a feather or a stone, is talking, and everyone else is listening and actively listening. So we're not sitting in the circle and we're thinking about what we're going to say when it's our turn. We wait until we get the object, and then we think about what we're going to say, because we're supposed to be listening attentively to that person. And that's also a good way of discipline in the classroom. Like, I used to do that with my students. I had a stone that would sit on my desk, and when we were in circle, we would hold the stone. And sometimes, like, if I were teaching or like a student were doing a presentation and some of the kids would start to talk, invariably one of the students would say, "Should I go get the stone?" Because some people are being rude. And they would just listen better, like when we're in a circle. So I would start every day with a circle. I'd end every day with a circle. Because so many kids go home and their parents say, "What did you learn at school today?" "Nothing." That's what my kids are like. They never learned anything at school. But we would recap the day when we were in the circle and talk about something good so that they all had, when they went home, could have like something interesting or good that happened that they could at least talk about with their family if their family asked. Again, using hands-on activities. I go into some classrooms that are designed for Indigenous students who don't do well in the regular classroom. And most of what we do in there is hands-on because they can't like sit still. So these kids, like they sit there and they're like hugging a stuffy and they've got like a fidget thing and whatever. But I can put them in a circle and we can talk for like 45 minutes. And these are kids like grade 2 to 5 in one class, and the other class is the high school students. But they can sit there for 45 minutes and not really interrupt because we're doing stuff that's relevant to them, and they know that we're going to be going out and picking medicines or having a fire or tanning hides. So they find that important. This is still pictures of trying to make a fire with the drill bow. So building the nest and getting the spark and stuff, which is also part of like the Ojibwe creation story. Like it starts with a spark. And when we make our sacred fires, we put a spark into a nest, and the nest becomes bigger and bigger. So it's learning about their culture and how to be. And especially like it used to be in the old days, like men couldn't get married until they could make a fire without using matches or a lighter. For effective classroom setup, when I was a core French teacher, I had to go with whatever setup the teacher had put in the room, but quite often I would like rearrange it and then rearrange it again at the end of the class, because for me, my favorite configuration was if I could have my desks in a circle. And what I would do in the morning when they would arrive, we'd put our chairs on the inside of the circle so their backs were to their desks, so you can see what everybody has in their hands, and we would do our check-in that way, and that's the way we would check out after as well. And we would teach just in that, in the circle, and at the end, so when they had to be pairs or groups, like some would sit on the inside of the circle, some would sit on the outside of the circle, and it worked fairly easily. And I always had a desk. I always had a student desk in the circle. Even if it was grade 5, I would have a desk or maybe 2 or 3 scattered around the room that I could just sit in and sit there with the students. In fact, one day I remember I was sitting, we were doing math, and I was sitting helping a couple of kids, but I was just sitting in the student desk with them. And the principal walked into my portable and scanned and didn't see anyone standing, so said, "Where's your teacher?" And this one precocious little girl stood up and said, "In this classroom, there are 21 teachers and 21 students. Which teacher in particular are you looking for?" At which point I thought I better stand up before the principal blows a fuse. But we all, like, for Indigenous people, we always say to our youngest ones, like, we learn from you. Like, we all learn from the kids. And at the start of the year, every year, I would say to my students, I'm probably going to learn as much from you this year as you are going to learn from me. And they're all, like, shocked because they've never had an adult to tell them before that they were going to be teaching me something. But everyone knows something that I don't know. So we're all teachers in the classroom, and I think that's important too. Setting clear expectations, I think that goes without saying for most of the students. Like they want to know what they have to do to get a level 4 or a level 3 or level 2. So having those expectations right from the start. For example, when I taught math, I would give them 10 points for a graph, but they knew that they were going to get like 1 point for actually using a ruler to make their graph, and 1 point for labeling each axis, or what they knew specifically what they had to do to get like 10 out of 10. And if they chose not to get 10 out of 10, that was up to them. But I gave them like very clear expectations so that they would know. And it was the same thing for like writing essays. I would say to them, like, when you're writing an essay, I want you to make a point. I want you to prove it, and then I want you to recap in every paragraph. And like years later, I would have students come back and say, wow, like the way you taught me to write an essay worked through elementary school, high school, university. I've got a master's degree, and I always just use your method of writing an essay. So if you teach them something and are very clear about how it should look, then they do it, because so many teachers just say, write an essay, and they have no idea how to do that. Scheduling, timetabling. Like in a high school, you don't really have a whole lot of choice about your timetable. You're given the timetable. I taught elementary a lot of the time, so sometimes some classes were scheduled in because they were my planning time or whatever, but other things could be changed. For example, the one year I had a grade 7 class, and they were very poorly behaved. Like their teacher the year before had a nervous breakdown because they kept trying to burn down his portable and put flies in his coffee. They were just nasty to him. And so the principal, and I had been the grade 8 teacher forever, but this one year there was no grade 8. So I had taught grade 7, and these kids were coming up to grade 7, and I said to the principal, it was a new principal coming in, I said, I'd like to go back to teaching grade 8. And he said, no, we've got this new guy coming in to teach grade 8, and I want him to have a good year. So I want you to teach grade 7, and he'll teach grade 8. And he had a great year. The principal said to me for this group, these were his exact words: I do not care if they learn one damn bit of curriculum this year. I want them to be good citizens, and I know you will do that. So we had to change the schedule a few times because some of the boys in that class did not like math, and math was right after recess. And I was the teacher that would never send anybody to the office unless like they were bleeding or something. And I didn't have duty the recess before math class. So the boys would go outside and they'd always start a fight with each other just for fun, because they knew the yard duty teacher would send them to the office, and it would take like pretty well all of math class before the principal would get to the bottom of it. So I looked to see who had gym right after first recess, and I switched so that we did not have math after first recess. We had gym, and whoa, all of a sudden there were no fights from the people in my class because they wanted to do gym. So you just have to put the things after the breaks that they really want to do so that they're not silly during the breaks when you're not the one in charge, if that's at all possible. Also, like breaking up the lesson into like manageable pieces too also helps, especially with the ones that have ADHD, which is like more and more prevalent in our schools. Like just do little sound bites and make it so that like there's going to be something exciting like towards the end so that they can do it. I had one grade 8 class that they were in core French, and it was a school with French immersion, so they didn't really want to learn French, and I was their core French teacher. And we had kids in it, like there's one kid in the class who'd been sent there because he'd beat up somebody at his home school, and he was just little and a bully. But so he would swear a lot, like he dropped the F-bomb like every day. But he was so used to getting sent to the office, and I wouldn't send him to the office if he did that. And but I would come into that classroom and I'd say, okay, this is what I want to get done today in French, and once everyone's like done this and we've like everyone's written like 5 sentences or whatever, we're going to go outside and we're going to play soccer en français. And they would get the work done because they wanted to go outside. And it worked out pretty well too, because at the time I was going through menopause, and in a class with like 30 grade 8s, nobody wants to be in that classroom too long because it's a smelly situation in there. So we would go outside every day, just for the last 10 minutes, but they would work so hard to get to have 10 minutes outside. Wait time. This is an Indigenous thing. We start talking and then there's a pause, and people feel they have to fill in the pause. Nobody likes to have that silence. But for us, we do stop, and it's not that we don't know what we're going to say. We just, I guess, leave time for creator and take our time saying what we need to say. But most of us, if somebody interrupts or tries to put words in our mouth, then we're done. We're done talking. So I was talking about this with the Limestone Board a few years back, and it was a group of teachers, and we brought in an Indigenous student, and I talked to them about wait time, like how important it was to just let the person finish what they're saying and don't try to finish their sentence. So we brought in I think she was about 15 or 16. She was from a northern community. Kingston gets a lot of kids from the north because it's got like 2 university hospitals, and there's like not very many hospitals in the north, so we get a lot of people in Kingston for like dialysis or cancer, so they bring their families there. So she was talking about her experience moving to Kingston and being in a Kingston school as opposed to like a school that was more culturally aware. And there were like 20 teachers all sitting in a row or sitting in a circle listening to her, and she started to cry. And nobody interrupted her. Nobody started to talk. Like everyone just waited patiently for her to collect herself and to continue going. And afterwards, she said to them, "Wow, that's the first time that teachers have actually really listened to me and not tell me what happened." Because what she was telling them about was her experience when she first came to the school. She had really long hair, and the girls were like jealous of her and saying like, "Why do you have such long hair?" And she'd say, "Well, it's our connection to our ancestors. Like that's why we have long hair." So outside at recess one day, one of the girls was chewing bubble gum and chewed it, then spat it into her hair. And this young girl was like mad and said, like, "Why did you do that?" And one of the other girls pulled out a pair of scissors and said, "Here, I'll get it out," and cut her hair. And the young girl went to the teacher on duty and said, "Hey, one girl spat gum in my hair, and then the other one cut my hair." And the teacher just kind of dismissed her, like, "Oh, it was an accident." Like, you don't accidentally cut someone's hair. And she felt like the school did nothing to help her, and we don't cut anyone else's hair without permission. It's like a whole ceremony with cutting the hair. So the teachers didn't understand like the importance of hair to Indigenous people, and just thought, they solved the problem, they cut out the gum. I digress. So drama and story, this is how we talk anyway. We just tell story after story after story. So including drama and storytelling into your classroom practice is kind of the way Indigenous people learn. Like we learn through watching and listening, and I think that's important for us. Like everything, there's a story about everything, and there's usually a few sides to every story about everything. Using authentic voice, like this is where you would bring in the elders or knowledge keepers, or if parents, caregivers volunteer to come in the classrooms. The students don't usually want to be the one with the authentic voice. Like my youngest son, he hated whenever anybody would say, "Hey, you're Indigenous, like what do you think?" And he never wanted to say his opinion. And as a teacher, even the school he was at, they had a talking circle one PED day, and he sat he knew the woman was Ojibwe, so he sat purposely to her right, because Ojibwe, we always follow the sun, which is clockwise, and Haudenosaunee Mohawks, they go moonwise. So he sat to the side he knew she wasn't going to go. And she introduced herself all in Ojibwe, and she said, who understood that? And he would not put up his hand because he didn't want her to know that he understood that, and he didn't want the other teachers to be going to him all of the time about any Indigenous issues or problems, like, because you end up being like the one person. Like in my school, I was the one equity person, and anything equity, the principal would come to me and say, Deb, we have this, or Deb, could you do anti-homophobia talks with like every class because no one else will do it. And that, like, we can't just have like one person doing all of the work of equity. It should be like everyone should be doing that. So bringing in these voices, and sometimes the voices are like videos or that way. Like it doesn't always have to be a person there in the room. Like there are a lot of good YouTubes out there and films that will give the same thing. Assessment methods. I think it's important to have like various assessment methods. I know that the students these days, everyone's got anxiety, and everyone's got test anxiety, and like nobody's going to do this test day and nobody shows up. I think it's important to have like other forms of assessment, like observation, or like they make a project, or they sing a song, or they do something that's not necessarily written on paper. And I say this for myself. I was terrible at tests. Like I was like a fairly intelligent person in school, but I was not good at tests. Like I remember in grade 13 doing physics, my physics exam afterwards, like the physics teacher said to me, were you high on drugs when you wrote that exam? And I wasn't. I'd never tried drugs, but like he said, I gave you a pass anyway because I know you're a good person, but like you did terrible on the test. Because some people are not good test takers, but they can talk to you about it, or show other ways that they know without it actually always being a written test. And like nowadays, like some people like take their tests home and do it, and I'm pretty sure they're not the one doing the test at home, that they're getting help from somebody doing those tests when they're allowed to take them home. Land-based inquiry. Yeah, those are pictures of me doing some tanning, and then like my little friends out there in the building structures. I think that being out in the land is important. It was for me, even as a teacher. I took my students outside all of the time. When I was teaching extended French, I would say to my kids at the start, dress for the weather every day because we are going to be outside. We're going to be outside when it's raining. We're going to be outside when it's snowing. We're going to be outside when it's sunny. Always make sure that you're dressed for the weather. And it was important for me to be out there, but it was also important for those kids to be there. And I was lucky I was in a school that was big, that had a big yard, and we had a couple of like sun shelters, and we had an outdoor classroom up on a hill that was just like big logs kind of set in a oval type shape. And we spent a lot of time outside, and I would also take them out just on nature walks to look at the medicines. Every year at our school, at the bottom of that hill that we had the class on, we had a naturalized area, and every year a pair of killdeer would build their nest there, and they would get to observe the killdeer's behavior. I'd say to them, when we go down the hill, like, everybody has to be quiet. There's killdeer here, and the male is going to try to distract us. He doesn't want us to know where his wife and the kids are, so he's going to pretend he's got a broken wing, and he's going to flop around with this like broken little wing, and we're just going to leave him be. And they just thought that was the most amazing thing. Like, we would walk around and we'd see the little killdeer pretending he had his broken wing to lead us away from where the nest was. And it's good learning for kids because sometimes they're in the city and they never get to see what birds do to help each other or to protect each other. So everybody talks about differentiating instruction. Like, that's so important that it's not all just standing there talking like I'm doing, because kids, that's not their best way of learning. They have to be doing something. I was talking on Wednesday in Toronto to a group of Indigenous educators, and we started off in a circle, and then when I was doing like the keynote thing, the person at the Federation said to me, do you want them in the circle or at their tables? And I said, well, I see they're trying to indigenize the space by doing beadwork and such, and I don't want to keep people away from their beadwork, so if they can listen to me and bead at the same time, they'll be happier. So they sat at their tables and they did their beadwork and listened at the same time, and everybody was happy. I think that's also important. I was thinking in terms of the troublemakers in classes, and this one little girl comes to mind all of the time. Like, she's a grown-up now and she's doing really well, but when I taught her in grade 5, she was so used to getting thrown out in the hall, and she was so used to crawling around on the floor, like bugging everybody. And I'm not a kick a person out in the hall kind of teacher, because I figure they're not going to learn anything out there. And I knew that she was being raised by her grandmother, and she had a rough life. And usually the ones that act out the most are the ones that need the love the most. So we just had a rule in the room that she was allowed to crawl around so long as she didn't touch anyone, so long as she didn't knock anything over, like, she could crawl. So for about the first 3 weeks, she would crawl around. And then eventually it was not fun anymore to be the one crawling around, and she sat at her desk, but it was hard for her to sit still, and I could see that. I would see her start to get antsy, and I just had to deal with the office. My class was on the 2nd floor. I would send her downstairs with an envelope addressed to the office, and she would have to take that down there. But I'd usually say to her, can you just go by the primary wing, because I was noticing their boots are not lined up very nicely, and that's like a fire hazard. Can you go sort out the boots in the primary hall and then come back to class? And she would go down there, sort out all the boots, give the note to the secretary, and then later in the day, when I'd see her get antsy again, and I'd say, they probably got an answer to my question now. Can you go back downstairs? And this time, like, just go by the grade 8 wing, because sometimes they're messy too. So just, if you see anything like on the floor, like, just pick it up. So she would do this and come back, and she'd get all of her work done. But she just needed like a job. She needed to get away for a brief amount of time. And she never took like a whole lot of time. She would just go and do that. And it was really helpful for her to be like reintegrated back in the classroom, because she was so used to just sitting out in the hall. Creating meaningful connections and engagement for like to keep the Indigenous students engaged, you have to do things that are interesting for Indigenous students, like, and that could be like reading Indigenous like storybooks or novels in your class, like helping them feel that they're part of the curriculum. Or in my class, I would quite often, in November 16th in Ontario is Louis Riel Day, so we would quite often make bannock. And this one year I had a class, they were scary at the start of the year, because when they walked into my class, there were 25 of them, and like 22 of them were like white blonde hair. And I thought like I was in the wrong country. I looked at all my kids and I thought, how can I have so many blonde kids in my classroom? And I looked in the other grade 5 to see if it was like a phenomenon that year that everybody was blonde. But she seemed to have like more hair colors in her room. And I thought, in my class, I thought, I am never going to learn all these kids' names, because they all look the same. They all got white blonde hair. I've never seen such a thing. But in that class, half of them were Indigenous. And so when it was time for Louis Riel Day, and we were going to make some bannock and talk about the Métis and such, it was raining the day. And this one boy, a Mohawk boy, came in and he said, "It's raining outside. Are we still going to be able to make bannock?" And I said, "Yeah, we'll just make bannock in the classroom." And his eyes he said, "They're going to let us build a fire in the classroom?" And I said, "No, we're not going to make it on a fire. We've got these little hot plates. We're going to cook it in a pan." But he was used to like putting it on a stick and cooking it in the fire. Like we do marshmallows, we make bannock that way too. So he was so excited that we were making the bannock in our classes, and it made him want to be at school, and the others as well. When I told the principal that there were 13 kids in my class that were Indigenous, she wouldn't believe me. She said, you've got a class full of blonde kids. And I said, well, just because they're blonde doesn't mean they're not Indigenous. They say they're Indigenous, and if they tell me they're Indigenous, I'm not going to question. But they loved that we did a fair bit of, I was never the Indigenous ed teacher, but I was never not the Indigenous ed teacher because I was the only one in the school, so I kept teaching them stuff. Here we're up north, and this was at an event that was in partnership with the police, and I don't know, Indigenous people and police don't really have the best track record. Like, we're disproportionately represented in the prison system, and it's not that we're bad people. It's just that there's so many stereotypes out there, and they just figure, like, if we're Indigenous, then we're guilty. So if teaching the students that not all police people are biased, and that they can also be helpful is good, because like I say, the history is not great. Like yesterday I was home and my doorbell rang, and there were these two men at my door, and they wanted to talk to me about the Bible. And I said, wait a second, I'm Indigenous. And they said, yeah, we see you got like Every Child Matters flag right here. And I said, yeah, but the people that pushed the Bible were never very good to Indigenous people, so I'm not really interested in your Bible. I was brought up Roman Catholic, but because the Métis side, we're all like super Catholic. But Indigenous people still have like a little hesitancy towards doing stuff with churches. And like now with all this truth and reconciliation stuff going on, there were so many times like people from a church like the United Church would call me and say, hey, we're doing this reconciliation event, and we were wondering if you could come open for us. And I'd say, so when are we having the planning meeting? They're there, oh, no, we've got it all planned. And I'm like, well, then I can't participate, because if I'm not going to be involved in the planning and you just want me to come as a token, then that's not reconciliation either. So we have to work together if we're going to be reconciling. If Canada's going to reconcile, it has to be Indigenous and non-Indigenous working together. Questioning and challenging. Like, I was always the teacher that would encourage my students to question and challenge. Like, we were always writing letters to the MP or the Prime Minister or the Mayor or the principal, like trying to get to be persuasive and to question. Like when I was teaching like grade 7 and 8 history, and we're doing like the Métis rebellions, I'd always say to them, like, whose voice is missing in this? Like, because history is always written from the side of the oppressor or the winner. Our side of the story is never told. So I would teach history from the Indigenous point of view. And then the other grade 7 and 8 teachers would say, can you come in and do a history class with my kids? Because everything's from the non-Indigenous point of view, like the way we look at science, the way we look at history, the way we look at geography is not the Indigenous way of looking at these things. So I always encouraged my students to, when they looked at something or they read something, like, we'd always say, whose point of view is missing here? Because there's always someone's point of view missing. And encouraging, like, I think the biggest thing that we could do for our Indigenous students and non-Indigenous students too is encourage them to be like proud of their heritage and to follow their gifts, because everyone's got talents and they just need somebody to notice and push them that way. For me, I was a terminally shy student. I would know the answer. I would not put up my hand because that's bragging, and we're supposed to be humble. But like the teacher, I went to Francophone schools, the teacher would ask a question and nobody would know, so eventually I just like raise one finger so that it was not too obvious, and then the teacher would ask me and I'd help her out by knowing the answer. But I was encouraged. When I first started teaching, I did not like to speak in front of crowds. I like to teach my class, but if we had to put on a performance in the gym, I would die 1,000 deaths. Like, I'd be like turn every shade of red, and I'd be shaking, and it would get to the point like the grade 3 teacher would say to me, Dab, if you prepare the grade 3s to like sing a song in French for the assembly, you practice in class with them, and then when it's the day, I'll get up and I'll be the conductor because I know that you're nervous about that. And I was, like at the start, I could not speak in front of groups. And then I just got tapped on the shoulder so many times, like, can you do this presentation? Can you do that presentation? That eventually it got so that I could talk in front of a group of people and not be so nervous and be able to sleep at night and wake up in the morning and not be sick to my stomach because from anxiety. But I think the students need to be encouraged too. There's one year, one of the teachers at my school, his son was coming into grade 5, and there were 2 grade 5 immersion classes, and he wanted his son in my class. And the other grade 5 teacher was really upset, so went to him and said, oh, this is the guy that got my grade 8 job, by the way, went to him and said, how come your son's not in my class? And he just said to her, well, Deb's a mom, and I think she'll be better with my son because he's a bit of a handful than her, because she was a really strict disciplinarian, and I was kind of like a mama disciplinarian. So the very first day, and I would do stuff silly because I was the grade 5 teacher, but that's the entry point for French immersion. They've only had 1 year of French, and I would not speak English during class. So I would have to be silly and draw and act out and make all kinds of strange voices. And his son just had the best announcer voice. And I noticed it on the very first day. So the very first recess, I go up to my colleague and I say, wow, your son's got the best voice, a super announcer voice. He's so good at drama. And he goes, you hold the record. And I said, what do you mean? He said, nobody has ever noticed my son's gift on the first day. It usually takes them months to figure out what his gift is. And you figured it out in the first quarter of the day. But encouraging kids to use their gifts, if they're good at something. And I think that helps them a lot. And I always tell educators too, because I get to speak to so many new educators at the Faculty of Education. I always say, and I said this before, when I was a teacher, do not use your eyes to look at your students. Look at them with your heart, because then you'll actually get to see them, which is kind of interesting because our Anishinaabe word for hello, there's 2, there's bojo and there's ani. And I usually like to use the word ani. Ani, it starts with ah, which is that little noise that we make when we're first born, that breath of life coming into us, ani. And when you're saying ani to somebody, you're saying to them, I see your light. I see the light. And in our Ojibwe creation story, it starts out in darkness, and the first thing that is visible to see is a spark. It's a little light. So when you're saying to somebody, I see your light, it's a more meaningful way of saying hello than just saying hello. So I think that's important. And yeah, we have I just put up a few of our words that have the word heart in it, because that I think that's it. Like, when you approach any of your students with love and caring, and you're going to make a better impression. There are a few, probably, I don't know, for a while I was working with the Ontario Arts Council, going into classrooms, and I was making dream catchers with students. And not that I recommend everybody make dream catchers with students. Like, it's an Ojibwe tradition. I'm Ojibwe, and you have to know the stories that go with it. So part of it, like, I teach them the whole story in that. But I was out of school in Toronto, and there was a little boy in that class who had just immigrated from China. He'd been in the classroom about 3 days, had 0 English, had 0 French. But he was keen to learn. And I am the type of person, if I'm going to show you how to make a dream catcher, I bring in like a hula hoop, and I use rope, and I show you how to do it like really visually. And this little boy, he listened to everything that I said. It took like a couple, like I told the story the first day. I don't know how much he understood, but like I had a fake spider, and I had spider webs and all this stuff. So I think he understood some. And then the second day we were making the dream catchers, and the second day I wore a voice enhancer with a microphone, and the second day I forgot to turn it on. So he came up to me and he pointed to it that I hadn't turned it on. Not that he was going to understand anything I said, but he wanted me to have my microphone on. So I put my microphone on, and I showed them how we're making these dream catchers. And then I look over, he is teaching all of his little buddies, all of these kids that do not understand him and he does not understand. He understood absolutely how to make that dream catcher, and he was helping everyone in the classroom. And what I really liked, he didn't know very many words in English, but on the first day when I was leaving, I said, "See you tomorrow," and he got so excited. And I thought, uh-oh, he's really excited because I said, "See you tomorrow." His teacher probably says that at the end of the day, and he probably thinks he's going home. He's going to be really disappointed. But the second day when I got to the school, he had been sent to the principal's office because he'd been fighting out on the schoolyard. Like, somebody had been picking on him, and he wasn't going to stand for it. He didn't understand the words, and they were just being mean to him. So he was sent into the principal's office, and the principal was having him draw a picture of what happened. I don't think he knew about the picture. That was supposed to be what happened. He just was drawing a picture. So then I happened to be walking by the office when the principal was saying to him, "Okay, you bring this to your teacher." And the little boy, he understood the word teacher. He goes, "Teacher, teacher." And he sat down and he started to draw a picture of his teacher because he thought that's what the principal wanted. But I think that for the kids that are learning their second, third, fourth language, we have to be like so much more kind to them, because like they're undergoing like a huge shock. And I know this for myself. When I was a kid, like I said, we went to Francophone schools in Penetanguishene, and when I was 11, we moved to France. And that was fine, like they're different French than Penetang French. But I was put in the same class as my brother that's a year younger. I was mortified because I was smarter than him. And when we went to France, I think it was 1970 or 71, they had the metric system. We did not have the metric system here at that point. And so they wouldn't send me to the lycée until I could prove that I could do math. And the way they set up their division problems is different. The way they rate their numbers was different. Like, I'd never seen a 1 with a tail at the front, or a cross 7, or a 9 that looks like a G at the time. So clearly for the French teacher there, I did not know how to write numbers, and it was just by some magic that I could get right answers sometime because I wasn't doing it right. And we used commas here to separate the thousands, and the comma there was a decimal point. So anyway, the teacher thought I was like some kind of idiot. So I was in the same class as my brother. But after a few months, they realized that it was just a misunderstanding, that I hadn't learned the metric system yet. And they put me over at the lycée, which was even more bizarre because there I had an English teacher who tried to speak British English with his French accent, and it was really hard to understand. But it was a learning process for us, and for myself and my siblings in France. The French people were like nice to us, but they were really mean to the Portuguese kids in the class, and there were Portuguese kids that lived next door, and we were kind of friends with them. I think you have more empathy for people from other countries when you've been a person in that situation.